No longer mourn for me when I am dead, than you shall hear the surly sullen bell give warning to the world that I am fled from this vile world with vilest worms do dwell. Nay, if you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it, for I love you so, that in I your sweet thoughts be forgot. If thinking on me then should make you woe, oh, if I say you look upon this verse, when I perhaps compounded am with clay, do not so much as my poor name rehearse, but let your love even with my life decay, lest the wise world should look into your moan, and mock you with me after I am gone. It's hard to make jokes about people's deaths, whether they died yesterday or centuries ago. Although we've agreed it's okay if the person that died was an absolute arsehole, or if their cause of death was just really, really funny.
Bitten to death by a severed head.
I'd forgotten to put on my stab-proof vest. I stabbed myself in the heart and I died.
And where were these rapids exactly?
Underneath Niagara Falls.
How come your armour didn't stop the arrow?
Oh, I wasn't wearing any armour.
You went into battle without wearing any armour?
Oh, totes! That's how I roll.
Don't make me say this.
Oh, we're all ears now.
I accidentally shot myself, okay?
But for Jane Seymour, the only joke is how little we seem to care. In the majority of these on-screen portrayals, she is shown dying immediately after giving birth, as opposed to having her own designated death scene, which can be drama gold if you do it right. But why should we care, right? It's not like Jane was cheated on and mistreated and ultimately abandoned like Catherine of Aragon, or falsely accused of multiple crimes and beheaded on Tower Green in front of a crowd like Anne Boleyn. Jane, she died in childbirth, as did many women of her time. What's so special about that? Especially if you're a male writer and you have to bog yourself down in the details and mechanics of the lady's lower regions, which is less preferable than just saying, "She dead, next." But this was definitely one of the moments in history where the direction of English politics could have gone in an entirely different direction had Jane lived. Could she have had more children? Possibly. Could she have had another son which would have cemented the Tudor dynasty? Perhaps. Where would that have taken us? What would have happened to Mary and Elizabeth? I have a theory that Britain breaking away from the Catholic Church in the 1500s, because Scotland also turned Protestant, and Wales was already an English province, and Ireland was conquered by England in 1536, saved it from falling into the fascistic regimes of mainland Europe that were heavily connected to the Catholic Church, like Franco's Spain. So determined were we not to have a Catholic monarch after Mary I that Parliament had to invite Mary II and William of Orange to rule instead of James II, and that allowed Parliament to gain more power to the point that now our ruling monarch is simply a figurehead, and it's only a matter of time before we declare our royal family obsolete and become a republic again. Like with the rest of the wives, Jane Seymour's defining moment is what makes her one word in a stupid rhyme. And we must admit to ourselves that we don't care about historical women unless their heads get lopped off. Keep in mind, I am very much exaggerating. It's sort of what I do, but I'm still right. In the 16th century, death in childbirth was common. For every 100,000 live births, 1,200 women would die. Considering that the population of England in the 1530s was somewhere around 3 million, this meant if you didn't have a relative who died in childbirth, you at least knew someone who did. Sometimes the woman would die during the act of labour, but more often than not it was because of infection days afterwards. We do take it for granted now because health standards are a world away from what they used to be, and we have access to antibiotics to combat bacterial infections. Although in developing nations, death in childbirth is much more common. In the United States, 19 women in 100,000 die per year as a result of childbirth complications, but the statistic in South Sudan is 1,150 per 100,000. And that's not even figuring the child mortality rate and the infant mortality rate, because that's a whole other level. One thing we have over the Tudor era is the ability to administer caesarean sections when it seems as though the mother or child's life is in danger. My sister and I were both delivered by a caesarean section, and after the procedure, the mother is always given a course of antibiotics. There are some sources of African tribes able to perform C-sections as far back as the 18th century, but in Europe the method would almost always result in the death of the mother. And it was so rarely used that this was why Macbeth didn't see his killer coming.
I bear a charmed life, which must not yield to one of woman born. Despair thy charm. Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped.
So what exactly was wrong with Jane Seymour? Why was giving birth so hard for her? Once again, we have to separate the facts from the lurid sources made by Catholics to vilify Henry VIII. I don't think Henry needed their help. These accounts claimed that Jane's limbs were stretched to ease the delivery, and that Henry was forced to have to choose between saving Jane's life or Edward's before deciding on a caesarean section which killed her. All of that is wrong. There are a number of reasons that make delivery difficult. The cervix might not dilate enough, or the infant doesn't go through the birth canal smoothly. The umbilical cord can get tangled around a limb. The shoulders can get stuck. With how long it took, it is likely they at least discussed the idea of giving Jane a C-section, but that would only be the absolute last resort. When Edward was finally born, Jane seemed to have recovered quickly and everyone thought the worst was over. The day after the christening, Jane's infections from the torn pineal and vaginal tissues caught up with her. She suffered terrible diarrhoea in the afternoon and was sick later that night. This is where lack of hygiene in the Tudor era failed her. Whether Edward was delivered by a royal midwife or by the king's own doctors changes depending on who you ask, but either way, you can guarantee they wouldn't have sterile hands when this happened. Her attendants were also accused of giving her too rich a diet after she gave birth and letting her get cold. Jane's condition rapidly declined over the next few days. The Bishop of Carlisle administered last rites. Suddenly she seemed to get better and Henry was relieved. The next day Jane had a fever and was caught in a state of delirium. Henry knew what was happening. Usually a whisper of someone being ill would send him running off in panic, but as he realised Jane was dying of the same puerperal fever that took his mother, he refused to leave Jane, knowing the infliction was not contagious. Remember, Henry was quite learned in medicine and diseases, mostly from being a hypochondriac, but he also founded the Royal College of Physicians. Jane died in her sleep on the 24th of October 1537, early in the morning, and it was likely that Henry was by her side when it happened. So I can't exactly do a full analysis like I did with Anne Boleyn, and it's usually a hint of how little the writer cares for this character. In the 1996 miniseries of The Prince and the Pauper, which starred Keith Michelle as Henry VIII for the third and final time, it opened on the night of Edward's birth. Once it's announced, Henry asks about Jane, and the silence hints that she's dead. But Jane doesn't appear on screen at all, and remember, if they don't appear, it doesn't count. In the private life of Henry VIII, Jane dies on the same day of Edward's birth, and I'm sure that set a precedent for future adaptations. Henry is sad for a few minutes, but it doesn't tear into him like you see with Keith Michelle's versions and even Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. Granted, this movie does seem like more of a storybook version of Henry VIII's reign, and childbirth in the 1930s was still a taboo topic. But it is still a little callous of the film to write Jane off so quickly as if she doesn't matter.
Get off with your nonsense. Your great big beard in the poor child's face. Not to frighten him out of his
Jane's death in Henry VIII 2003, as I demonstrated in my last video, is very, very stupid from beginning to end. The timelines are off for one thing. It's meant to take place immediately after Robert Aske's death, which was in July 1537, and Edward wouldn't be born for 3 months. The fact that Henry is made directly responsible for Jane's death, her dying only a few minutes after giving birth, and Henry's dramatic caterwauling afterwards, does make me wonder if George Lucas was taking notes while he was writing the Revenge of the Sith script. The timelines add up too well to be ignored. I mean, technically Padme died because Palpatine was using the Force to drain her life and keep Vader long enough to get him into the suit, and the childbirth has just finished her off, but that's not officially canon, it's just how we rationalise this, but it's the best excuse we got. And the dramatic "No!" or shouting someone's name was pretty impactful in the past, such as realising your dad is this guy.
Search your feelings, you know it to be true. No!
or if you're about to be fed alive to birds. Or if this bitch steals your mask. But it's one of those things that has been used so much, it's lost all meaning, and most of the time you just burst out laughing every time someone does it, because it just feels so unnatural. The only person that does it well anymore is Taron Egerton. Nuff said. Let the trope die. Right, moving on to Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and there was more to it than my South Park reference. This version actually uses the Spanish Chronicle as the source of Jane's death. Jane's been struggling for hours, and no wonder. You don't give birth lying on your back because it stops you from being able to push the baby out. A woman approaches Henry and tells her he has to choose between Jane's life and the child, and Jane is telling them to save the child. So it's implied that Henry made the decision to allow Jane to have a C-section where she died. At least they show the aftermath, and Henry's just buried alive in his trauma from having to make that decision. In Six the Musical, Jane's death is referenced in her song and in the in-between dialogue. This actually captures the sadness that the real-life Jane must have been going through with not being able to be a mother. The other queens don't really take her seriously though. After her song, she says, "What hurts more than a broken heart?" To which Anne replies bluntly, "A severed head." After Anna of Cleves' song, she again tries to assert her tragedy, and Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn remind her that Henry royally screwed them over. Catherine Parr tries to move on to Catherine Howard, and when Catherine regards Jane, she has the most amazing reaction.
"Jane, dying of natural causes. When will justice be served?"
And eventually, Jane just has enough of the other queens picking on her and shouts,
"Baby Mary had the chicken pox and you were there to hold her hand, you know. It's funny because when I went to hold my newborn son, I died!"
And she gets in a hair-pulling contest with Catherine Howard. She won't be overshadowed just because she died in childbirth, and that's why I love this interpretation. In The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, we don't see Jane giving birth, but the aftermath is the framing device for the whole episode. Every time we're in the present, we hear this intrusive twanging sound. It's not a heartbeat because it's there to show how painful it is for Jane to keep hanging on. It's sort of a pulsating pain. It's like when you have a terrible migraine and you're pushing through your shift at work so you can get home as soon as possible, but you can't ignore the pain, and the beats finally fade off at the same time Jane passes out, unable to hold on any longer.
You see, my lord, Louis may die, or the horse may die, or I may die.
And then we have the Tudors, which is the only version so far that has done it right. It captures Henry's growing anxiety and doesn't sugarcoat anything, as it shows Jane drenched in sweat. The only big inaccuracy is having Lady Mary be there, as unmarried women wouldn't be allowed in when women were giving birth. Protects their innocence or something. But given the bond she and Mary have built, it's acceptable for her to be by Jane's side for dramatic purposes. They discuss the possibility of Jane having a C-section to save the child, but Henry finds it an impossible decision. As I've theorised, it seems that going to that length would be an absolute last resort, and Jane luckily manages to give birth before they go through with it. There's a bit of a subtle touch to the aftermath before Jane falls ill. Here, although Jane is kitted out and resplendent when Henry sees her, she's clearly not well, given how tired she looks. After the christening, we immediately cut to Henry being told that Jane is ill, showing just how quickly she fell into decline. It is strange that the doctors don't realise what's happening, but that was probably a lead-in for Henry to say,
"It's childbed fever. I know because my mother died of it."
And yeah, I like that when he's at her bedside, tearfully praying to God, it's toned down, it's not overly dramatic, there's no shouting. It's, dare I say it, human. And that's why I like the Tudors, because even though it's not 100% accurate, the characters feel human and the development feels natural.
My son needs his mother. And I need my queen.
Dying in childbirth isn't glamorous to some writers. You can't use it to fridge a girlfriend. You can't use it as motivation for revenge. Usually it's an excuse as to why this one character is incomplete, because they never knew their mother. And it's a quick way to kill off a female character when she no longer serves the plot. We don't hail those who died of natural causes unless it was some kind of disease or cancer that took them before their time. Anne Boleyn died as a result of political intrigue and backstabbing. We see the tragedy of an innocent person being executed and going to her death with her head held high. We like to tell the story of those who were murdered and build whole subcultures speculating what would have happened if they survived, and the long-reaching consequences of a single moment that shook the world. A woman suffered as a result of poor cleanliness and had a slow, painful death. And all we can say in response is, "When will justice be served?" with a heavy layer of sarcasm. I mean, spoiler alert, Catherine Parr also died of puerperal fever, but because she had a successful political career beforehand, we care more about that than her death. And unfortunately, because of the collective view of Jane Seymour is she wasn't all that special, her on-screen counterparts tend to disregard the tragedy, and no sooner are we done with her than we skip ahead to Cromwell arranging Henry's fourth marriage. At least the Tudors made the effort to have a whole episode following Jane's death where Henry is dealing with his grief. I don't know, I just think Jane deserves better. All the other wives deserve better. Well, Anne is doing pretty fine, but the others got robbed. Oh dear, Telly's snoring. Okay, I was meant to do this bit in front of the camera, but because of this whole drama with my laptop, we are so behind schedule that I just thought, sod it, we'll just record it. Before we get into the next half of the video, I think the best time to do a slightly unrelated middle piece is here. So you might think this is a bit silly, but call it a show of integrity. When I'm wrong, I'll admit it. Okay, when I mentioned Lola Pettigrew in my last video, I was told in the live chat during the premiere that Lola actually goes by they, them pronouns. I looked Lola up and it turns out they identify as queer and use both she, her and they, them. I know it doesn't seem like that much of a big deal, but as an LGBTQ member and an ally to all those who identify with different pronouns, I felt a bit bad for not doing enough research on Lola Pettigrew, so I apologise for that, and I hope Lola won't hold it against me if she ever sees the video. I don't know if she will. So I'll do better next time, and of course, if I'm covering something that comes out recently and I'm covering an actor, I will check for pronouns next time. And in compensation, I drew this picture of Lola because that magic school idea gave me a bit of inspiration. I don't know how good it is. I haven't done any drawing for a while, and I thought I could colour in with felt tips, but I don't think I can. Also, I must confess, I haven't read the Hilary Mantel novels that Wolf Hall was based on. I mean, they are huge, and I tend to get put off by anything that's longer than 500 pages. I'll get round to it, but I was mostly interpreting the series on how it stood on its own and reflected history. So I didn't know in the books that Cromwell actually sees Jane as a strategist and cleverer than she looks. But the problem is, that's not the interpretation I found in the miniseries, because the creators were abridging a collective 1100 pages into 6 episodes, and Jane's contribution was clearly abridged to the bare minimum. I'm sure her contribution in the novels pays off in the mirror and the light, but we'll get to that. I'll get to that. I don't know. I've been getting a few comments saying that Jane Seymour wasn't blonde, so I'm trying to double check by looking at the historical sources. Besides her portrait, the other surviving source describing her appearance is from Eustace Chapuis, saying she was fair with pale skin, average height, but no great beauty. The Holbein portrait presents her with compressed lips and quite a large nose. Her eyebrows are quite pale to the point of being invisible, so even though her hair is covered by a gabled hood, assuming she was blonde is excusable. Plus, Edward VI's portraits reveal him to have blonde hair, which is something he must have then inherited from his mother. Of course, blonde doesn't account for one single shade. Her on-screen counterparts tend to have their Janes with gold-toned hair, which works as a stark contrast between her and Anne Boleyn, showing how different they are. although it does sometimes look as if these actresses spent 3 hours getting a full head of highlights at Tony and Guy to achieve the look, especially the two girls in the Tudors. And Stallybrass's interpretation gives Jane more of a dirty blonde look, which looks unremarkable but adds to the theme of Jane's plain personality and establishes how she's gone unmarried for so long. As we get further into this, things are going to be more obscure. Literally only one of the actresses playing Catherine Parr has the right hair colour. I think we've established how toxic this complex is when it comes to the woman considered to be a licentious hussy who only wants to screw her way to the top, reducing her character to little more than her appearance and declaring any woman in a sex-positive light as somehow a bad thing. But the harshness on the women who are considered Madonnas also suffer from this stark binary mindset. For Anne Boleyn, stripping her down to a dark temptress luring Henry away from the Queen with the promise of sex is disempowering because it cheapens the intelligence and principles of her real-life counterpart. For Jane Seymour, imagining her as a saint-like figure that can do no wrong puts her and women in general on a pedestal with expectations that no woman can possibly live up to. The Jane Seymour Henry envisioned every day after she died was an idea, a wife who did her duty and gave him an heir that outlived him, the one that listened to him, that never spoke up and kept her head down. Living this way would have given Jane very little freedom where she couldn't speak her mind because Henry would threaten her with death. She could never be the one who was sad and needed comfort because selfish sociopathic Henry wouldn't dog himself down in the lamentation of the women, those emotionally unstable, underdeveloped beings. And sex was a whole other thing. When we see women as Madonnas, they're chaste prudes, but the idea of them getting pregnant means they must have done it somehow. Yeah, but it was only to have a kid, and they wouldn't have got on top or anything like that, and she probably didn't want to have sex anyway, because the second a Madonna shows interest in using her body for her own pleasures, she drops straight down to a hussy. How bloody dare she get out of the tiny, tiny box society has put her in? Who gave her permission? What would her husband say? I woke the cat up by saying that. I'm sorry, Ted. You're not going to purr, are you? This is why we never see Jane Seymour engage in sex scenes with Henry in all her on-screen counterparts. Sorry, I can't stop laughing at the idea I woke Tetley up. In fact, when I was regarding the Alison Weir book, I did a double take when not only does it show her and Henry doing it, but doing it before they get married, while Anne is still alive. The thing is, the casual historical fiction viewer assumes Anne Boleyn is the sexy one, so they're expecting her to bang and for her to have had at least one experience before marrying Henry. Tetley. Oh no, I hit your purr reset button. Jane Seymour has always been this pure ideal, however, so the most they show is them just laying in bed and talking. In the Tudors, the sex scenes are toned down a lot after season 1, to the point that there's only a few in the 3rd season. With fewer episodes, it wanted to focus more on the political aspects and the build-up to Cromwell's downfall, so the more intimate scenes were held on the back burner, but it still can come off as a tad hypocritical. The binary complex is disgustingly toxic on both sides, demanding women be a certain way and do everything men want and never get angry with them. I wouldn't have been surprised if Jane and other women of her time had nervous breakdowns because of the ridiculous restrictions.
Cool girl. Cool girl is hot. Cool girl is game. Cool girl is fun. Cool girl never gets angry at her man.
Okay, there's a Tetley cat on my lap and she is purring and she will not leave. So we're just going to have to go through with this and work with it. But it won't matter because this is a pretty heavy part, so I think having a cat purring in the background might help. A relationship doesn't have to be violent to be abusive. And when a man has shown he is more than willing to toss aside women who don't meet his expectations, that is no love story. When Jane dared to try and appeal to him, not for herself, but on behalf of other people she didn't even know, Henry literally told her that if she continued to do so, he'd have her killed. yet more evidence that he could have anyone executed for the flimsiest of reasons. Think about it. If you truly love someone, could you really threaten them with death like that? This clearly frightened Jane so much that when Henry turned on the Pilgrimage of Grace and had several people executed in grotesque ways, she couldn't do anything to intercede on their behalf. Tetley, you've got so many clumps. I do like that we get to see her on-screen counterparts experiencing the stress of living with Henry's tempestuous nature. But I think the best two that lay the true ugliness of the situation bare are, again, the Tudors and the 6 Wives of Henry VIII. And oh my god, Alan's here now. He's really jealous because I'm sitting with the cat on my lap and he wants to sit on my lap, and oh my god, and my lap's not big enough for two. If I was morbidly obese, maybe this would work. In the former, the emotional abuse is subtle, where Henry tells her not to spoil anything, as if the foundation of their marriage rests solely on her shoulders and peace must be held at all costs. And the camera lingers on her uneasy face. Henry won't allow another wife to assert herself. And Tetley is very much asserting herself now because she was refusing to leave even though Alan is giving her the guilt stare. In the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, it's made quite clear that Jane cannot confide her feelings to Henry, and her outpouring of stress and despair to Edward seems as though this has been building up for months and she can't keep holding in her fear. Would she have felt the same if Henry hadn't threatened her? How can your marriage be happy when you can't be honest with him and you're terrified of his wrath if you say the wrong thing? I don't believe any of the 6 wives had anything resembling a love story with Henry VIII. With Catherine, her unconditional love for him wasn't reciprocated, and he was likely thinking about that verse in Leviticus every time she miscarried. He looked the other way and signed the death warrants of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, allowing others to do his dirty work. Anna of Cleves goes without saying, and he was more than willing to have Catherine Parr arrested for simply questioning him. I don't see Jane Seymour as the exception who just shut up and kept her head down because she wanted to. She had no choice. Alright, the cat's calmed down now, so she might start again if I script her head, which is her purring reset button. Whether Jane knew her predecessor really was innocent of the crimes she was accused of is unknown, but there is no doubt that Jane contributed to Anne Boleyn's downfall, whether she meant to or not. When Anne refused to become Henry's mistress, but agreed that if he were free to marry, she would willingly be his, she had set a precedent for 2 of the wives that would follow her. The first was for Jane, who was likely encouraged by her family to repeat the strategy of the woman they were planning to supplant. Jane the Conservative did not want this reformation, and knew being queen meant she could be at the forefront of Catholic allies and reverse the movement. So the motivation was there, and the opportunity? Henry was growing tired of Anne, and Jane was a younger single model without a blemish to her name. She was looking at spinsterhood with 2 of her younger sisters married before her, and many women would settle for a match, no matter how incompatible, if it meant not living in poverty or obscurity. Jane was not wholly mild and meek, as she was quite strict with her household and distanced herself from the maids of honour she used to serve with, and mingled instead with the duchesses and countesses of higher rank. And behaviour like that has to hint at some kind of ruthlessness, right? Even if it's just a little bit. Plus, I'm fairly sure she knew what she was doing when she returned the king's gift and letter, which made Henry want her even more. Still, it would be ignorant to place all the blame of Anne's downfall on Jane's shoulders. In truth, she had the luck to be in the right place at the right time. No matter what, Thomas Cromwell was going to find a way to get rid of Anne before she got rid of him, and perhaps Jane was simply putting herself forward as a viable replacement. It would certainly be a twist if her future on-screen counterpart were actively plotting against Anne, but it might be more diabolical for her simply to look away and try not to think about the bloody business that would put her on the throne. Plus, it would be hypocritical to condemn Jane for replacing Anne Boleyn when she herself replaced Catherine of Aragon. Both women were pursued by Henry, and they, being religious women growing up in a religious time, would not have wished to compromise their virtue, which would hinder their marriage prospects. It's more likely that this is the reason both women resisted Henry, and not so they could coax and tease him. No one's hands were clean in this business of pleasing King Henry VIII. Trying to find easy villains cheapens the true events and sorts real people into little boxes. Regardless, given the mild-mannered and kind person we know Jane to have been, she wouldn't have found Anne's death anything to be happy about. Normal people don't tend to want people to die, especially in such a grisly manner as being beheaded. Jane probably had no respect for Anne, and that made the business of replacing her somewhat easier, but her hands were just as dirty as everyone else's in sending Anne to an unjust death. Which is why it's infuriating when some of her on-screen counterparts appear so innocent and ditzy. I don't want that. Let her be ruthless. I've had a month for my anger to wear off, but to say I didn't like the 2021 series from Channel 5 is an understatement. If the 2003 version of The Other Boleyn Girl is the Room of Tudor dramas, The Twisted Tale of Bloody Mary is Birdemic, and the ITV's Henry VIII was Battlefield Earth, I think that places Anne Boleyn 2021 as the last airbender of Tudor dramas, and I will just let that salt sink in. Meanwhile, Gaetano Donizetti's Anna Bolena was an underrated gem and, of course, gave Jane a larger role than she usually gets when your story ends with Anne Boleyn's death. I was okay with Lola Pettigrew's performance as Jane Seymour, but I couldn't help thinking that it needed more. It was missing something, but I couldn't put my finger on it, and I found it in Anna Bolena, with the relationship Anne and Jane have in the opera. At the beginning of the Channel 5 series, Anne does infantilise Jane quite a bit, referring to her as her little mouse, which at the same time hints at some form of affection. I thought this was going to hint that Anne might have liked Jane, or at least envied her for being so innocent in such a threatening world. Had the series been a few episodes longer or simply better paced, we could have had more interactions between Jane and Anne. I wanted to see how they acted towards one another behind closed doors instead of yet another version that trod the same beat and didn't do anything different between them. Instead, we got a random kiss, which, now I've had time to think about it, was very obviously shoved in as queerbaiting. If it had simply been used as a way of greeting, I could forgive it, but yeah, you could have taken it out and lost nothing of value. That's just weak screenwriting. You wrote a bad script, Petey! The opera, on the other hand, at least gave Jane a character arc. We should have seen how the portrayal affected Jane's Christian conscience. We should have had a scene where Jane and Anne are alone together and Anne tries to take her anger out on Jane but cannot, realising that if she must face death, she will face it with forgiveness. Instead of long, arduous scenes in the third episode that drove me crazy, why not have a brief meeting with Jane? You're already playing fast and loose with dramatic license, why stop now? I want to see Jane Seymour cry tears of guilt while Anne decides to be the bigger person and lets her off. I want to see Jane trying to stop the execution and telling Henry that history has its eyes on you, only for him to toss her consideration aside, and yet she still marries him because she has no choice and the guilt will follow her for the rest of her life, trapped with a man who has the power to kill her.
Jesus.
I think what I want in a future interpretation of Jane Seymour is simply don't write her off and don't make her boring. Build up a relationship with her and Anne before all this downfall stuff happens. We've seen the rivalry. Wouldn't it be more emotionally wrenching if they were starting to like each other before Henry's ego got in the way? One of my peeves in these Six Wives portrayals is when the other wives are only introduced when they become relevant to the plot and to Henry VIII. Granted, Amelia Fox's Jane had a brief cameo in the first half before she became relevant in the second, but that doesn't really count as build-up. Catherine Parr was nearly killed during the Pilgrimage of Grace. Do you know how many adaptations cover that? None. We've seen enough of what happens when Henry is there. What happens when his back is turned? With people who are so obscure as Jane, you have the freedom to go deeper into character, as long as you stick to their overall personality. Also, stop killing her off the second she gives birth. So after all this, because I haven't come out and said it yet, what are my thoughts on Jane Seymour? Do I hate her for supplanting Anne? Do I feel sorry for her because of having to put up with Henry when he'd gone beyond the point of no return when it came to domination? Well, the truth is,
I don't know.
when I was younger and my perspective of history was really black and white, I hated her. But that hate lasted about a month, then season 3 of The Tudors aired, and that whole realisation of the emotionally abusive relationship made me grow up. Jane is so obscure and it's hard to build a strong opinion of her, but the fact that she has such a vague personality and we usually give credit for Anne Boleyn's downfall to the men means there are several opportunities to go deeper with her character, like they did in the opera, but most of the time they either ignore it or save that conflict for after they're married. And now Alan's here and Tetley's off my lap and I'm sure he wants to jump on my lap right now. Maybe I'd like Jane Seymour if she was written better and wasn't so damn innocent. Let her out of that box, please. Have fun with her, make her devious before marrying Henry, then pile that guilt on her afterwards. Go full Lady Macbeth on her. She is more than an Ophelia. Anna of Cleves at least gets played about a bit because there is so little to go off of, and that's where we'll go next time. And there we have it, we finish with Jane Seymour. Granted, you might be relieved if you don't like Jane Seymour, but you might be excited if you're looking forward to Anna of Cleves. And yeah, I've very nearly finished the ranking script. Because there are fewer versions of her, I thought I'd just try and put more into each segment rather than just be like, done, 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 next video. I'm somewhat into the Catherine Howard rankings too, but we'll get the Anna of Cleves stuff all written and recorded and get that out of the way as well. And then we'll move on to Catherine Howard. And I'm also working on something for October, so if you're a patron, you probably already know this. I want to do something for Black History Month, and it's going to be a bit of a surprise. I'm not going to be looking at just one person, I'm going to be looking at a whole range of people. So it's going to be very different from what I'm doing at the moment, but I think this is an experiment. I just want to experiment what I've got on here. I've got a platform, I want to do some good with it. I want to donate a portion of the revenue I'll earn in October to Black Lives Matter. So if you're interested, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you're notified of all my updates and you'll be able to be with me when that happens. And as always, a big thank you to my patrons, especially you, Anastasia Gracia, who is my VIP patron. If you want to become a patron, you can follow the link in the description and you can get rewards from having your name in the credits and getting early access to scripts or being able to see a video first before anyone else can on YouTube. If you become a VIP patron, you'll get a shout out in the credits just like Anastasia, and you'll be able to get some writing advice from me. But if not, you can always like the video, share it around, and make sure you subscribe and leave a comment because that really helps me get out to more people, and I'm really looking forward to bringing you more stuff. I cannot wait to see your reaction when we get to Catherine Howard. This is building up, isn't it? So I've got so many ideas of what we can do with this channel, and I'm so looking forward to what we can do next. Anyway, I'll see you next time when it comes to Anna von Cleves, or Anna of Cleves, or Anne of Cleves. We can say it any number of ways we want,